Here today with us.
Chris, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and talk about team communication with you all. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's get that started. Okay. There, I think that's working, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So thank you all for being here today on this Friday afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about team communication, which everybody knows communication is important. We hear it all the time, whether we're talking about relationships, we're talking about working with people within our workplace. We know that communication is key, but knowing that doesn't automatically translate into good communication, especially in a work team setting. So today I'm going to talk about evidence-based practices that can help people work more effectively in teams and really can help improve communication. Okay, sorry, I have to scroll through all this. Okay, so in terms of objectives today, oh, this is probably blocking your view. Let me move this. Okay. All right. So in terms of objectives today, I'm going to start very briefly by talking about what is good communication and what is not good communication. And I'll spend just a little bit of time there highlighting specific forms of communication that research suggests can really benefit teams. We'll have a brief discussion activity where you can talk about experiences you've had in your own life, in the workplace, where you've had really good instances of communication and maybe some not so good instances. Then we're going to talk about some barriers that make communication in teams especially challenging. And we'll also talk about what you can do to overcome those barriers. And we'll also have a group decision-making activity that, depending on how it goes, may illustrate one of the common problems teams face when they're communicating. And then we'll end with time for questions and answers. So jumping into it, I'm not going to spend too much time here because I think intuitively we all understand why team communication matters. Regardless of how much you rely on your team members, even if you need to work with them every day or you are only working with them infrequently, you just touch base every so often, depending on what you're doing, communication matters. And there's evidence to back this up. We know that communication predicts performance, regardless of the team type, regardless of the industry, there is a strong relationship. And even though we know that there is a relationship, we know that it matters, we don't necessarily know how to put that into practice. For example, there's evidence that diverse teams can be really innovative. And I don't mean diversity just in terms of surface features like ethnicity or gender. I mean deeper level traits, things like our cognitive strategies, our approach to work, our just our different viewpoints, our life experience. We know that people bringing different expertise, for example, to teams can really create some innovative solutions. But those teams in particular face a challenge in communicating, and it can be harder to communicate in a cross-functional team or a team with diverse expertise than other teams. And overcoming those challenges and reaping the benefits can be especially challenging. And that's just one example of how teams might struggle to communicate. But all this to say that even though we are really aware it's important, we don't necessarily know how to do it. And in the case of teams, we might be reaching the not so great outcomes. Maybe we're doing okay, maybe we're not making massive catastrophic mistakes, but we could potentially be doing better. And just briefly, I did want to acknowledge that communication is not only what takes place in a face-to-face setting. I think the pandemic made us all especially aware of this. We also communicate through nonverbal channels where there are some specific difficulties that are um, common when we're communicating in those forms via email or any asynchronous form of communication. And we'll talk about what some of those challenges can be later. But to start things out, I did want to give you an opportunity to think about how you've seen communication unfold in your own professional lives. And I'd like to put y'all in groups where you can talk about some instances of good communication you've witnessed, some instances of bad communication you've witnessed. And there are a couple questions here to help you think through those experiences you've had. But basically, I just want you to think about some good and bad instances of communication you've had in the workplace. And then we can see later on if it potentially maps on to some of the problems that are common in teams communicating. So if we could go ahead and create some breakout groups, that would be great. Let's see. So Gray, if you could help me create some breakout groups, that'd be really, yeah, thank you so much.
I open to it automatically assigned you and Chris, but you don't have to go, obviously.
Thank you so much, Gray. Yeah, I should have mentioned beforehand, I don't know how to do breakout groups. I'm
I'm
sure it's
doing
pretty
quick now.
straightforward, but
Yeah. Yeah. And then do you want me to move you into either of them? Do you know how? Do you need me? Do you just want to chill here for a minute?
you can move me into one. I'll see what they're talking about. All right, sorry, just gonna get everything set up again. All right, so thank you so much for chatting about that and sharing your experiences. I heard a lot of things that I think relate to what we'll talk about in this session. I'm gonna go ahead and skip through the discussion just in the interest of time. But I do want to start by talking about what is ineffective communication, and then I'll highlight some forms of communication that research suggests are particularly important for teams to perform well, function well, all
Excuse
those good
me,
things.
Shanna.
Yes.
You have you usually switch the view of the PowerPoint. We are seeing the presentation side.
Oh, I see. I
Uh-huh.
see. Hold on. Are you seeing the?
Now it's correct. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So one thing I did want to mention is too much communication can be a problem. And I think this is maybe a little bit of common sense. If you are sharing too much information, it can result in information overload where you're having to kind of search through the information to identify what's actually important. And communication frequency has a curvilinear relationship with performance, meaning that too little communication is bad, but too much communication can be harmful as well. So when you are communicating with your team members or in whatever context you might be in, you want to focus on quality of communication. So what is quality of communication? There are a couple of types of communication that we know are beneficial, one being knowledge sharing. This is pretty straightforward. It's just sharing your expertise with team members. So taking time to maybe sit down with them, walk through some kind of process, or even just sharing a link or a resource, things like that. Obviously, that's going to help them perform the task better. It's directly related to the task. But another thing, and this came up during the breakout session I was in, that can be helpful is openness of communication. And this one can be a particular challenge because it does require a degree of vulnerability with your team members. And some people are more comfortable than others speaking up, even if they don't feel particularly safe in the context of the team. We're talking about psychological safety in our breakout session, which is this idea that within teams, if there's a climate of psychological safety, we feel a lot more comfortable speaking up and sharing our viewpoints, versus if there's not psychological safety in place, we might not feel comfortable, we think we might be punished, or we might experience negative consequences. So it can be hard to foster this type of communication if that psychological safety isn't there. A lot of this depends on the leader, depends on the organizational culture, but it also depends on team dynamics. And if you're able to speak up, for example, about something you disagree with, even if you're the lone voice of dissent, you can model to your team members that it's okay to do that. But again, if it's not a great environment for that to begin with, that can be really hard to do. But we know that teams that are able to engage in this communication can really benefit from it. They can potentially identify problems or solutions that might otherwise have been lost. Another form of communication that's really important is information elaboration. And what this is basically just really making sure you're processing everything your team members are saying and you're updating your own understanding of the situation based on what they've shared with you. So you're not just passively receiving the information, you're actually actively thinking about how it impacts your own view. And you might share with your team members, okay, so my understanding has changed based on what you've told me. So you want to make sure you're really integrating what's been shared with you into your own view of the situation. And I mentioned this during my breakout session, but another form of communication that's really beneficial for ensuring good outcomes or making sure we're all on the same page is closed loop communication. This is when you receive information and you confirm that you've received it. So I mentioned you don't want to do that for every piece of communication, right? If it's something minor, you don't want to be spamming people with okay, okay, okay. But if it's a really important thing you've been told, you do want to confirm that you've heard them, you've received that information, and you understand. Finally, I did want to mention reflexive communication. This is a process of intentionally and deliberately sitting down with your team and talking about what went right, what went wrong, what are our goals, are we on the same page? And having those conversations, just making time for them, can go a long way in helping you get on the same page and maybe even identify problems or figure out how to address problems and ultimately perform better. And this is just a brief summary of everything I mentioned. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to barriers to communication. I did want to spend some time talking about virtual communication challenges because that's become more relevant in recent years. And then I wanted to end by talking about something called information processing failures, which is a common thing that groups can experience. So as we know, during the pandemic, a lot of us switched to a fully virtual workplace, and a lot of us suddenly had to figure out how to communicate in a less than ideal situation. We no longer had that access to face-to-face communication. A lot of it was through email. A lot of us started using Zoom more heavily. And even though some workplaces are now kind of shifting course and requiring people to come back, a lot of companies are still allowing people to work virtually, at least more than were before the pandemic. So for that reason, I think it's important to talk about virtual communication and some of the challenges there. So these are the main challenges that are associated with virtual communication: ambiguous communication, limited team member availability, establishing group dynamics. That's far more challenging if we're not having those impromptu conversations, running into each other in the hallway. And also, this is another thing that came up during our breakout session, or during the breakout session I was in, was engagement. And specifically in the case of virtual meetings, that can be a real challenge. So I'm going to talk about the problems and then briefly outline some potential solutions for overcoming those issues. I think we've all had the experience where we've received an email or we've received a text and we're kind of baffled. We don't really know what they're implying. Maybe it seems more hostile than it's meant to seem, or maybe it's just unclear if they're being rude or what they're trying to say. And that's because we can't read their tone, right? So that can cause issues when we're trying to figure it out, especially if we don't know them very well. It might be kind of awkward to follow up on it. So that's one potential problem. We might also misunderstand what they're trying to say. When we're not face to face, we can't immediately ask those questions that pop into our mind. So we might be missing information. There's just a lack of clarity. So it's not the same, the communication is not as rich as we experience when we're meeting face to face. These are some potential solutions for making this communication, this virtual communication, a little bit clearer, a little bit better. First of all, and this one seems obvious, but sometimes it can be a challenge. I'll admit I'm guilty of this as well. If you're having a hard time working something out over email or something's not clear, you probably just need to bite the bullet and go ahead and schedule a meeting. I know sometimes we don't want to make time for meetings, we're busy. It can feel like a waste of time, but it can really help if you're just struggling to get somewhere over email. It's not working out. It's also good to, again, close the loop. And if it's a really important piece of information, or say it's something like a deadline, you want to let the person who sent the message know that you've received it. That can be really important, just for making sure, again, that you're on the same page. And again, just making sure, okay, if we're having issues here, this is too complicated or it's taking too much time to talk about via email, let's just meet for a little bit in person or over the phone, whatever it is. Another challenge associated with virtual communication is a lack of availability to team members. So some people might not be available when you need them, or you just have to get used to delayed responses or delayed clarifications. So if you need information from them to work on your immediate task and they're not available, that can be a problem. So ideally, some things you can do to work around that is have in mind that you have maybe a reoccurring meeting where you have time to go over those questions or concerns. So maybe you're writing down things that you know you need to get clarification on before the meeting. You're aware you do have that point for check-in, so you're prepared and ready to go when you do have that meeting. That can help a lot. Also, just knowing that people have certain schedules can help. For instance, you know that somebody on your team is always checking their email in the afternoon, so you can expect to get clarification on something by that time. You can kind of build your schedule around it. And also just knowing who is working when, just having access to that information. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's not always the case that you have access to this information. So having some kind of schedule can help a lot. And these are some additional ways that you can kind of overcome issues associated with that. I'll go through this briefly, but having a shared space for documents. I'm guilty of this myself. Sometimes I'll be working on a project, I'll send a PDF or I'll send something via email. And then later on, we're in a meeting and we're referencing that. And then it's a matter of kind of scrounging around, trying to find that PDF, trying to find that resource. So if you take the time to just quickly create a shared drive, upload everything, that makes things a lot more streamlined, a lot easier, and also making sure you're not leaving anybody out. So even if I mean, obviously you don't want to loop people in if it's completely irrelevant. They don't need to be on every email chain ever, but just making sure that people are included on the most important messages or announcements or updates. Another problem that people can experience if they're working in a virtual environment, especially if, say, you're joining a remote team or you're working on a remote project, it might be harder to establish those group dynamics that would naturally be created in a face-to-face environment. You're not running into people again in an impromptu situation. You're not seeing them in the hallway. You're just seeing them when you're having work meetings. And that can be a problem in that we talked about the importance of psychological safety, building trust, building psychological safety, having that comfort, speaking up about potential issues or even bringing up mistakes. That can be a lot harder to do if we don't have those dynamics in place. So it's important to kind of build some of that, even if we're not, it's a lot harder to do when we're meeting virtually. In some ways around that, so not everybody loves virtual socialization, right? This isn't always the most exciting thing for everybody, but it can go a long way if you have the opportunity to create a, say, a virtual happy hour. Just give people a chance to get to know each other. You don't necessarily have to be best friends with everybody, but just getting to know them a little bit can go a long way in helping make group dynamics a little more comfortable. And you can also just maybe start making the culture where it's common to reach out to people for non-work related reasons, whether it's sharing a research article or just asking them a non-work related question. I know this sounds obvious, but a lot of times we're really busy and we don't have time to do these things. We have a lot going on. But if you do just spend a few minutes getting to know your colleagues, it can go a long way in creating those group dynamics if you're in a more virtual setting. Finally, I did want to mention in the context of virtual communication, it can be really difficult to establish engagement during virtual meetings. And I can be guilty of this myself as well. If it's a large meeting, I might turn off my video. I'll admit to that. But it can be hard to also stay engaged within these meetings for those reasons. Also, if you're at home, I know there are distractions. For me, I might have dogs barking, there's things going on. And this is something that everybody experiences. So if you're the meeting organizer or if you're attending one of these meetings, what can you do to make it a little bit better? There are a couple of things. First of all, it's always ideal if the meeting is actually necessary, right? We don't want to attend a meeting that could have been summed up in an email. So want to make sure that this meeting is really necessary. And if you're the organizer, it's really good to be very clear about why we need this meeting and go in prepared as well. So if you have a meeting agenda and you have notes ready to go, you have a very clear agenda and reason for meeting, that can really help make sure that, first of all, you actually need the meeting and keep people on task. And also, I personally find this really helpful because if we're, again, in a virtual setting, even in a face-to-face setting, we might miss things that are just said in passing. There might be a lot going on. So having a debrief email after meetings, summarizing responsibilities, deadlines, those kinds of things can be really helpful. And to some degree, yes, we should all be responsible for listening, and people should be aware and should ideally write down, okay, I need to get this done. These are my tasks. But it doesn't always happen, so it's good to reiterate that information. Now, before we move on to the final section, I did want to have a brief group activity, and this will help. Well, I don't know, you guys might do really well, or it might not work out ideally, we'll see, but this is a team decision-making activity that will tie into what I'm about to talk about in a little bit. And so I'm going to assign you to 3 or 4 person teams where you're going to take on the role of a manager. You can be manager A, B, or C. I'll share the materials in the chat, and you can only refer to the materials associated with that role. And if you can follow the instructions, your goal is to identify the best candidate for the job. So I'm going to go ahead and quit sharing so I can share those materials with you. Okay. And then we'll put you into some breakout rooms. Let's see. All right. So I've just shared the materials. Gray, I'm going to ask for your help again. Thank you so much. If you could help me put them in breakout groups of 3 or 4. Let's see how many people we have here. Okay, I think it actually works out where we have 3 groups of 3. And I'll give y'all about, we'll say 5 to 10 minutes. We'll see how it goes.
So Shanna, quick question.
Mhm.
So we should select one of these 3. Each one of us is going to be one of those, right? Of what is manager A, manager B, manager C, correct?
Yes, exactly.
And we are only seeing that document, the specific one that for us.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think we're ready to go.
A couple folks still in their like breakout rooms, and I think
Oh, okay. I just wanted to double check that. I thought maybe we lost some people, but there we go. Give a few minutes for everybody to get let back in.
yeah, 10 seconds, and then they'll all be back.
All right. Got it. All right. Thank you all for participating in that. I know it's the kind of thing you could potentially spend a very long time talking about, so we did the very light abbreviated version. But I can say in our group, we chose candidate B. So I don't know which candidate y'all chose, but oftentimes it's not candidate C, which is the correct candidate. And again, I know you had limited time, so it might have been, oh, y'all got it. I see somebody got it. Very nice. Okay. You avoided an information processing failure. Okay, I kind of spoiled it, but I'll get to why that happens or why most people do not choose the correct candidate. Here's all the information that each person received, right? So everybody got access to these details. This is what's called common or shared information. So everybody on the team was aware of these things. But everybody also got access to unique pieces of information, meaning you were the only person who knew these things. Nobody else on the team knew. So altogether, we had a combination of things everybody on the team knew and a few things unique to ourselves, which is very common in real life situations, right? We have common information, we have unique information. But if we were able to go through in a very systematic way, which would be hard to do, right? Even in our limited time span, especially, but even in a real life group setting, people typically don't go through it in this manner. But if you go through it in sort of a systematic way, it becomes clear that candidate C has the most positive qualities. And so a lot of times people do not pick candidate C. And as to why that is, that's called an information processing failure. An information processing failure is when teams fail to share information or identify the most important information. We get sidetracked. We're talking about things that don't matter as much, or we have a bias in what we're choosing to focus on. It can manifest in a number of ways. We'll get into specific forms of information processing failures, but these are all common things that groups can experience. And some of the major information processing failures that teams are prone to, the first being we're failing to share or discuss relevant information. That might have happened in your group setting where we didn't all share the unique pieces of information that only we had access to and that got lost. Or maybe we're not fully elaborating on the information. We're not thinking through the implications and we're missing something. And finally, this is just sort of human nature. We're all prone to these things, but we might not be updating our previous ideas or our previous conclusions. We've committed to something and it's hard to change that conclusion. And just to give a few examples of these specific situations or specific information processing failures, when we are not searching for and sharing all relevant information, it might be a common knowledge effect, which is something you may just have experienced. This is a tendency when we're in a team. We tend to talk about information that everybody has access to. We don't focus as much on things that are unique to one person. So if one person comes in, unless it's sort of groundbreaking information, if they're bringing unique pieces of information to the conversation, we don't give them as much weight. We don't talk about them as much. Another thing, the hidden profile effect, that's also the activity you just engaged in. This is when not everybody has access to all the same information, and we're making a decision without the full details. And in real life, this can, like outside of the little activity we just did, this might manifest in somebody's coming in with documents shared in an email from weeks ago, everybody else forgot about it, and so people are coming in without complete access. Another thing that might happen is we are motivated to focus on things that are aligning with our own interests, or we might have a different idea about what the purpose of our meeting is about or what the purpose of what we're doing is. Say you have a team with a marketing person and an engineer. The engineer might be more focused on, okay, what is feasible? What can we actually practically build here? Whereas the marketing person's goal is about the customer. They're thinking about what can we do to appeal to the customer? We're coming in with different goals, and that might influence the kind of information we're sharing and focusing on. So how can we avoid this failure? There are a couple of things that can be done to make things better. Having enough time to discuss, that might have played into what happened in some of our groups today, not having enough time, but making sure that we have sufficient time to really systematically go through all of the information is important. And also making sure that everybody does have access to the information we're referencing, even if that's resending an email that was sent weeks ago that everybody forgot about, just making sure everybody has that. It's also important that we go in with an open mind, which is easier said than done. A lot of times we decide on something beforehand. Maybe it seems obvious to us, so we're not as open to new pieces of information or new perspectives. It can also help if we're thinking about what we're doing or what we're deciding on as a problem. We're going in trying to think of the best solution. We're systematically evaluating the information, the possibilities, and also just making reflection a part of your team culture. Just taking time to talk through things in a critical way. And we're not just kind of making assumptions or letting things that don't make sense kind of just pass by. We're actually actively bringing these things up and talking them through. The second failure, where we're not fully thinking through the implications of the information or we're not elaborating on it, there are a couple of ways this might manifest or might happen. One example is framing. So the way we're approaching the problem or the way we're presenting the problem is going to impact how we solve it. For example, if we're framing something as a potential loss, we might make riskier decisions if we're thinking of losing something. Whereas if we're thinking of it as a gain, we're going to make less risk-averse decisions. So that really impacts our decisions and how we're going to do things. Another thing that plays in here is heuristics. These are sort of mental shortcuts we use when making decisions or thinking about things. One example of this is an anchoring bias. If we start with one piece of information, that can influence how we see other pieces of information. For example, say you're going to buy a computer and you start by looking at Apple's. Apple computers, Apple products are really expensive. So if you use that as your kind of reference point, your starting point, everything after that's probably going to seem a lot cheaper. I know that's kind of an extreme example, but if you go in, even if you're looking at, say, a shirt and it's a $50 shirt, and that's your kind of point of reference, everything after that that costs less might be perceived as inexpensive, anything more as more expensive. We're just kind of using one thing to inform all of our decisions, and we really shouldn't do that. Another thing that might happen is we have positive illusions. For example, maybe we're overly confident in the team, so we focus on more optimistic or the more optimistic outcome we think is going to happen. We're not giving potential problems as much weight or as much time. And maybe some of that positivity is warranted, but it's still good to be fully aware of the bad things that can happen or the good things. And then the best ways to get around this is to ground your decisions in data. Just make sure you are backing them up with real evidence. And then I'm going to quickly go through the final one. Just very briefly, I won't go through specific examples, but this is basically when we've committed to an idea and we don't want to change our conclusion. And ways we can work around that is just actually interrupting the work and having conversations with our team members to make sure we're actually pursuing the best course of action and being open to new information and being open to changing our mind, which is easier said than done. We're all guilty of this to some extent. And that is everything I have for you. Thank you so much for your attention. I've really enjoyed chatting with you and sharing this, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Oh, thank you, Chris. All right, yes, thank you, everybody. I see some people have to head out, but yeah, I really enjoyed getting to talk with you all and share this with you.
Thanks everyone for coming, and if you can, fill out the reflection feedback form that Gray will send out in just a bit. But thank you, Shannon, for that, and thank you everyone for attending these sessions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Really enjoyed being a part of this, so thank you for including me.
Happy to.
Great.